What kind of man would trade a billion-dollar name for a janitor's uniform just to discover whether anyone could love him for who he truly was? Before sunrise in rain-soaked Seattle, single father Mason Reed stepped out of a black SUV 1 block from his mother's glass skyscraper. Beneath a cheap Navy uniform, he wore a pink bracelet made by his 9-year-old daughter. Inside, executives walked past him without seeing him. One even dropped a coffee cup beside his mop and kept moving. Mason had survived divorce betrayal and the quiet fear that every woman saw his fortune before she saw his heart. But this story is not only about hidden wealth. It is about dignity, fatherhood, trust, and what happens when love begins inside a lie. Stay until the end. Like the video and comment where you are watching from. But before Mason Reed became invisible inside his mother's company, he had spent years wishing people would stop looking at him. 3 weeks earlier, he sat beneath a chandelier in a private dining room above Lake Washington wearing a dark suit that cost more than most families spent on rent in a year. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. A pianist played softly near the windows. Across the table, Claire Whitmore smiled at him as though she had already memorized every article ever written about the Reed family. Eleanor had arranged the dinner without calling it a date. She had described Claire as intelligent, accomplished, and from a respectable family. Mason had heard those words many times before. They usually meant the woman knew how to behave around money. Claire leaned closer across the table. "Your mother says you may take a larger role at Reed Global. She says many things. She must be proud." Mason lifted his water glass. "She worries more than she celebrates." Claire laughed as if he had made a joke. His phone vibrated beside his plate. He looked down and saw Sophie's name on the screen. "Excuse me." Claire's smile tightened. "Of course." Mason stepped into the hallway and answered immediately. Sophie's face filled the screen. Her brown hair was pinned back with 2 silver clips, and she wore the blue dress she had chosen for her school recital. "Dad, they moved my song earlier." Mason glanced through the dining room doors. The first course had not arrived. "How much earlier?" "We start in 20 minutes. His chest tightened. He had promised he would be there before she walked on stage. "I'm coming. Really, really." He returned to the table and reached for his coat. Claire stared at him. "You're leaving. My daughter has a recital. I thought dinner was important." "It is." "Then sit down." The ease with which she said it stopped him. Mason looked at her carefully. "My daughter is 9, and she will have other recitals. She will not be 9 again." Claire sat back offended by the finality in his voice. Mason did not argue. He thanked her for the evening, apologized to the waiter, and left before the first plate reached the table. Traffic locked the highway beneath a sheet of rain. Red brake lights stretched ahead of him like a wound that would not close. By the time Mason reached Sophie's school, the auditorium doors were opening and parents were spilling into the hallway. He found Sophie near the stage in her blue dress, holding a paper certificate against her chest. Her teacher stood beside her. Sophie looked at Mason, then glanced behind him as if part of her still expected the version of him who had promised to arrive on time. "I missed it," he said. She nodded. "You said you were coming. I tried. You always say that when work wins." The words were quiet. That made them worse. Mason crouched in front of her. "I am sorry." Sophie looked down at her certificate. "I did not forget any of the notes. I knew you would not. You did not hear them. No accusation followed." She simply walked toward the exit, and Mason rose slowly to follow her. In the car, Sophie fell asleep with the certificate resting in her lap. Mason drove through the dark streets without turning on the radio. At a traffic light, he looked at his daughter's reflection in the rearview mirror and saw how much of her childhood he had already allowed to happen in rooms where he was not present. Claire's words had irritated him. Sophie's silence broke him. When they reached the waterfront house, Mason carried her upstairs. He removed her shoes, pulled the blanket over her, and placed the recital certificate on the nightstand. As he turned to leave, Sophie opened her eyes. "Was the dinner for work?" Mason stopped. "Not exactly. Was it another lady Grandma wants you to marry?" He sat on the edge of the bed. "She does not want me to marry anyone I do not love. She just wants you to hurry." Mason almost smiled. "That sounds like Grandma." Sophie picked at the corner of her blanket. "Did the lady like me? She has not met you. But did she ask about me?" Mason remembered the way Claire had told him to sit down. No. Sophie's face did not change, but her fingers became still. Mom used to ask about me. Mason looked toward the window. Rebecca's name had become a room inside their home that neither of them entered without caution. She still cares about you, he said. She lives in Boston. I know. She missed my birthday, I know. Sophie turned away from him. Do not bring home someone who only likes your house. Mason felt the full weight of the promise hidden inside her words. I will not. You swear, I swear. She held out her small hand. Mason wrapped his fingers around it. That night, long after Sophie fell asleep, Mason stood in his study with the lights off. Seattle glittered beyond the windows. Ferries moved across the black water. The city looked calm from that height, as if distance could make every problem beautiful. On the desk lay an old photograph. Mason, Rebecca, and Sophie stood in a garden 3 years earlier. Sophie was missing one front tooth. Rebecca's hand rested against Mason's chest. Anyone looking at the picture would have believed they were happy. For a while, they had been. Rebecca had been brilliant, funny, and fearless in rooms where other people became nervous around the Reed name. That confidence had drawn Mason to her. Years later, he discovered she had been sharing confidential information about a Reed global acquisition with a man she claimed was only a friend. The man used the information to make a fortune. Rebecca used part of the money to prepare a life without Mason. The betrayal became public before Mason could protect Sophie from it. Children at school repeated things they heard from their parents. One afternoon, Sophie came home and asked why her mother had sold secrets. Mason never forgot the look in her eyes. It was not only confusion. It was the moment a child realized adults could make promises they never intended to keep. The divorce lasted 11 months. The newspapers followed every hearing. Cameras waited outside Sophie's school until Eleanor threatened legal action. Rebecca eventually moved across the country. She called when guilt became louder than convenience, but Sophie had stopped waiting beside the phone. Mason remained. He learned how to braid hair badly, how to make pancakes shaped like stars, and how to sit on the bathroom floor when Sophie cried behind a locked door. He also learned how quickly affection could become negotiation. Women asked about his homes, his company shares, his mother's will, and the possibility of appearing beside him at charity events. Some were less obvious than others, but Mason had become skilled at hearing the question beneath every question. What could loving him provide? A knock sounded at the study door. Eleanor entered without waiting. She wore a gray coat over a black dress, still dressed from the dinner. At 64, she carried herself with the controlled stillness of someone who had spent decades making powerful men wait for her to speak. You left Claire at the restaurant. Sophie had a recital. You missed it. Mason looked at her. Eleanor saw the answer in his face. She removed her coat and placed it over a chair. I should not have arranged the dinner. No, you should not have. I thought she might understand your life. She understood the balance sheet. Eleanor sighed. You assume the worst before anyone has time to prove otherwise. I have given people time. You give them tests. I pay attention. You watch for betrayals so closely that you never notice anything else. Mason turned toward the windows. I will not make Sophie live through another Rebecca. No one is asking you to. You keep bringing strangers to the table. I keep hoping one of them might make you remember that your life is not over. My life is upstairs. Your daughter is not a replacement for every relationship you are afraid to have. Mason faced her. That is not what she is, I know. But she sees you building your entire world around protecting her. One day she may believe love always looks like fear. The words struck somewhere Mason had not prepared to defend. Eleanor softened her voice. She sees you survive. She does not see you trust. Mason looked away. Rain moved across the glass in silver lines. What do you want me to do? Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the photograph on the desk. Come to the office tomorrow night. Why? Because I have an idea you are going to hate. The following evening, Eleanor did not take Mason to the executive floor. She led him through a service corridor beneath Reed Global Development, past storage rooms and loading bays, until they reached the custodial break room. Metal lockers lined one wall. A vending machine hummed beneath fluorescent lights. Someone had left a half-finished crossword puzzle on a plastic table. Mason looked around. Why are we here? Eleanor sat in a molded chair. Because no one important meets here. That is a terrible thing for the owner of the company to say. Yes. She gestured for him to sit. Mason remained standing. Eleanor folded her hands. You believe people cannot see past your name. Most cannot. Then remove it. Mason stared at her. Explain. You spend 90 days inside this company as someone no one wants anything from. What exactly are you suggesting? A temporary position with the custodial team? For several seconds, Mason said nothing. Then he laughed once. You want me to become a janitor. I want you to become invisible. That sounds like something a bored billionaire invents after too much wine. I have not had wine. That does not improve it. Eleanor stood. People show you their best behavior because they know who you are. I want you to see who they are when they believe no one important is watching. And you think I will find love beside a mop bucket? I think you may find the truth. Mason walked to the vending machine and stared at his reflection in the dark glass. Why here? Because this company belongs to our family, and yet I suspect there are parts of it neither of us understands. You want an undercover audit. I want my son to stop assuming every person in the world has already failed him. Mason turned. And if I meet someone, you do not tell her who you are. That is not trust. No, it is an experiment. With another person's feelings. Eleanor's expression changed. She had expected resistance, but not that objection. You would have to decide when honesty becomes more important than the test. Mason thought of Sophie asking whether Claire had asked about her. No. Eleanor nodded once, accepting the answer. Then she walked toward the door. You are right. Mason frowned. She paused with her hand on the frame. It is unfair. It is intrusive. It may fail. But you are already testing every woman you meet, Mason. You simply do it from behind a dinner table while she knows exactly how wealthy you are. She left him alone in the break room. The following morning, Mason found Sophie sitting at the kitchen island building a tower from pieces of toast. He poured coffee and watched the tower collapse. Grandma wants me to work at the company. Sophie dipped one piece of toast into maple syrup. You already work there. Not the way she means. He explained the proposal in language a 9-year-old could understand. Sophie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked, You would clean bathrooms, possibly. Other people's bathrooms, yes. She looked impressed. Grandma must be really mad at you. Mason laughed. She thinks I need to see people differently, do you? He lifted his coffee. That is a dangerous question before breakfast. Sophie considered the plan. Would people know you are rich? No. Would they know I am your daughter? They could know I have a daughter. They could not know my last name. Would I have to lie? You would have to keep a secret. That is lying with better clothes. Mason nearly choked on his coffee. Sophie folded her arms. You tell me not to lie. You are right. Then why can you? Mason sat across from her. I do not know if I should. Sophie studied him with the solemn concentration she usually reserved for math problems. Do you want to do it? I want to know if someone can care about us without caring about the read name. Us, you and me. Her expression softened. If you do it, you cannot lie to me. I will not. And you still come home for bedtime. As often as I can. That is not a promise. I will come home for bedtime unless there is an emergency. Sophie reached for her stuffed rabbit on the empty chair beside her. Swear on Mr. Pickles. Mason placed one hand over the rabbit's worn ear. I swear. 3 days later, Eleanor called a meeting with the head of human resources and the company's general counsel. They created a temporary employment record using Mason's first name and his middle name as a surname. His file was sealed. His photo was excluded from internal directories. The rules were precise. He would receive the same hourly pay as any temporary custodian. He would use public transportation. He would live in a modest apartment owned by a property subsidiary, but he would pay rent from his temporary wages. He would not access executive offices without permission. He would not open confidential files. He would not influence contracts, promotions, or disciplinary decisions. Only Eleanor, the human resources director, and the general counsel would know his identity. Sophie would remain in their waterfront home with her usual caregiver during school hours, but Mason insisted on returning to her every night. Eleanor objected. You are supposed to live within the conditions of the experiment. I am her father before I am your subject. Eleanor did not argue again. Mason's first shift began before dawn. Frank Delgado met him in the loading bay. Frank was 58, broad-shouldered and moved with the careful stiffness of a man whose knees had learned to predict rain. He looked Mason up and down. You ever run a floor machine number cleaned commercial glass changed an industrial vacuum filter number? Frank stared at Mason's hands. You ever cleaned anything I have loaded a dishwasher? Frank closed his eyes. Lord, send me patience. Within an hour, Mason had used too much solution on the lobby floor. The machine slid sideways and struck a planter. Water spread beneath a row of chairs. Frank shut off the machine and handed Mason a stack of towels. You said you had experience. I said I learned quickly. You lied quickly. By noon, Mason's back ached, his shoulders burned. The cheap uniform scratched his neck. He had never been so aware of his own feet. Frank ate lunch in the break room, unwrapping a turkey sandwich from wax paper. Mason placed a vending machine sandwich on the table. Frank looked at it. You planning to eat that? That was the idea. Read the expiration date. Mason checked. It had expired 2 days earlier. Frank tore his sandwich in half and pushed one piece across the table. First lesson, the vending machine is not your friend. Mason accepted it, thank you. Second lesson, nobody upstairs knows this room exists unless a pipe breaks. Over the next several days, Mason began to understand what Frank meant. Employees left food on conference tables and complained when it was not removed quickly enough. Managers held meetings about company culture while custodians waited outside to empty their trash. Temporary workers paid full price in the cafeteria, where a single lunch cost almost an hour of their wages. A supervisor told Frank to delay a medical appointment because the executive floor needed extra polishing before a client visit. Frank agreed without protest. Later, Mason saw him sit alone in the supply closet, pressing both hands against his swollen knee. You need a doctor, Mason said. I need a paycheck. Does the health plan not cover it? Frank laughed. It covers enough to tell me what is wrong. Fixing it costs extra. Mason pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Frank watched him write. What is that? Things I do not want to forget. You some kind of reporter number union organizer no. Frank narrowed his eyes. You are strange, Mason. I have been told. At home that night, Sophie found the notebook beside his lunch bag. She read several lines aloud. Broken elevator near loading bay. No paid time for equipment training. Frank needs knee surgery. She looked at him. Are these bad people? Mason loosened the collar of his uniform. Most people are not only bad or good. Then what are they comfortable? Sophie waited. Mason sat beside her. Sometimes people get comfortable not noticing what hurts someone else. The next morning, Mason was emptying a wastebasket outside a conference room when he heard Grace Bennett's voice. Her presentation filled the wall screen with images of a waterfront housing project. Green roofs curved above open courtyards. Wide windows faced Elliott Bay. A child care center occupied the ground floor beside a public garden. Grace stood at the head of the table. The revised material plan lowers energy costs by 19% without removing the affordable units. Derek Vaughn leaned back in his chair. Derek was polished, confident, and practiced at smiling while disagreeing. The affordable units remain the weakest part of the proposal. They are part of the city agreement. Agreements can be renegotiated. So can profit expectations. Several executives looked down at their notes. Derek clicked to the next slide. These savings came from my request for a new supplier analysis. Grace's eyes sharpened. I developed that analysis with my team, and I approved it. You rejected it twice. Derek's smile did not move. We are presenting a unified proposal, Grace. Then stop calling it my project when you need someone to blame and your project when there is applause. Silence settled across the room. Mason stopped moving. Derek closed the laptop. Talent opens doors. Attitude closes them. Grace gathered her papers. Then I will use another door. She walked out and nearly collided with Mason's cart. For 1 second, anger still burned across her face. Then she saw him. Sorry, you did not hit me. Give me time. Mason looked toward the closed conference room. That seemed productive. Grace laughed, despite herself. You heard that the trash was very educational. She leaned against the wall and rubbed her forehead. I spent 6 months on that project. It is good. Grace looked at him. You saw it, only the screen, and you understood it. Some of it. Before she could ask more, Derek opened the conference room door. His eyes moved from Grace to Mason. Is there a reason this hallway is blocked? Mason pulled the cart aside. "No, sir." Derek walked past without thanking him. Grace watched him go. Then she looked back at Mason. "Do not call him sir. It encourages him." That afternoon, Mason found several discarded drawings beside Grace's department. He was tying the trash bag when one page slipped onto the floor. A suspended walkway crossed the center of the design. Mason recognized the load calculations in the margin. Something did not align. He stared at the figures, then checked the material specifications. The support ratio was wrong. For several minutes he stood alone beside the cart, trapped between the rules of the experiment and the possibility that silence could become negligence. He carried the drawing back to Grace's office. She was not there. Mason circled the error in pencil and left the sheet on her desk. The next morning, Grace found him polishing the glass outside the design studio. She held the drawing in one hand. "Did you mark this?" Mason turned off the machine. "Yes." "How did you know the calculation was wrong?" "I have read construction manuals. For work for interest." Grace looked at the drawing, then at him. "You noticed something two engineers missed. They were probably looking at the larger design, and you were looking through the trash. That lowers expectations." Grace stepped closer. "You are either the most overqualified janitor in Seattle or the worst liar." Mason smiled carefully. "Can I be both?" Grace did not smile back immediately. Her eyes moved over his face as if she were searching for the edge of a mask. Behind the glass wall, Derek stood inside the conference room and watched them. Grace lowered the drawing. "Thank you, Mason. You are welcome." She returned to her office, but she looked back once before closing the door. Mason reached for the handle of his cart. Across the hallway, Derek's gaze remained fixed on him. The next morning, Grace arrived before sunrise carrying 2 cups of coffee. Mason was wiping rainwater from the marble floor outside the design department when she placed 1 cup on the edge of his cart. "Black," she said. "No sugar." He looked at the cup, then at her. "You remembered. You saved my project from a structural failure." Coffee felt appropriate. "I only noticed a number that could have become a lawsuit." Mason accepted the cup. "Then perhaps you should have brought breakfast, too." Grace stared at him for half a second before smiling. So the quiet janitor makes jokes. Only before 7. She stepped into her office and left the door open. That small detail stayed with him. Most people closed doors when he passed. Grace left hers open as though his presence required no change in her behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, their mornings developed a rhythm neither of them acknowledged. Grace arrived early because Derek had begun scheduling reviews before the rest of her team came in. Mason adjusted his route so the design floor was polished before she reached her desk. Some mornings they exchanged only a greeting. Other mornings, Grace leaned against the doorway while Mason worked and told him about the latest argument over her waterfront project. Derek wanted polished stone imported from Italy. Grace wanted locally produced material with a lower environmental cost. "He says clients expect luxury," she told Mason one morning. "What do you say I say luxury should not require shipping a mountain across an ocean?" Mason smiled. That probably went well. He asked whether I wanted to design buildings or save the planet. What did you tell him? That I was trying to do both. On another morning, Mason found a broken scale model on the studio floor. Someone had knocked a section of the roof loose during the night. He carried the damaged piece to the custodial room and spent his lunch repairing it with glue wire and a small blade from Frank's toolkit. When Grace found the model restored on her desk, she searched the hallway until she saw Mason changing a trash bag. "You fixed it." He glanced at the model beneath her arm. It was already mostly intact. "You matched the original roof pitch," I guessed. Grace tilted her head. "You guessed with suspicious accuracy." Mason returned his attention to the trash bin. Grace stepped closer. "Where did you learn this?" He tied the bag slowly. "My mother worked in construction." That answer was true enough to hurt. Grace studied him but did not push. Instead, she set a wrapped sandwich on his cart. "You missed lunch yesterday. How do you know you were still here when I left the cafeteria? Maybe I ate somewhere else." "You did not. Are you monitoring me? I pay attention." The words were casual, but Mason felt them settle beneath his ribs. He had spent years surrounded by people who watched him closely. They studied his clothing, his schedule, the people beside him, the value of whatever he drove. Grace did not watch him that way. she noticed when he had not eaten. That evening, Mason returned home later than usual and found Sophie asleep at the kitchen table with colored pencils scattered around her. Her caregiver, Mrs. Lewis, stood near the sink. "She tried to wait for you." Mason looked at the clock. It was nearly 10. "I said I would be home by 9. She said emergencies are allowed." This was not an emergency. Mrs. Lewis gathered her coat. "You are allowed to have a life, Mason." He looked at Sophie's sleeping face, not at her expense. After Mrs. Lewis left, Mason lifted Sophie carefully. She opened her eyes as he carried her upstairs. "You smell like lemons. Industrial cleaner. Did you clean a bathroom several?" She smiled sleepily. "Was the coffee lady there?" Mason stopped at the top of the stairs. "What coffee lady? The one you told Grandma about?" "I did not tell Grandma about anyone. Grandma asked if a woman at work had been nice to you." Mason made a quiet note to speak with Eleanor. Sophie rested her head against his shoulder. "Is she pretty?" "She is kind." "That means yes." Mason carried her into her room. The next afternoon, a storm moved across Seattle faster than expected. Wind bent the trees along the waterfront. Rain hammered against the tower windows so hard that the city disappeared behind gray water. At 2:30, Mason received a message from Sophie's school. A transformer had failed. The building was closing immediately. Mrs. Lewis was trapped across town behind an accident. Eleanor was in a board meeting. Mason had no choice but to leave work, collect Sophie, and bring her back through the service entrance. Frank looked up from the break room table when Mason arrived with a wet child in a yellow raincoat. The boss, Sophie, pushed back her hood. "I am Sophie." Frank extended his hand. "Frank Delgado, your father does not know how to use a floor buffer." Sophie shook his hand solemnly. "He does not know how to use the washing machine either." Mason closed the door behind them. "I know how to use it. You turned my White Sox pink. That was one time." Frank pointed toward a chair. "You can sit here, Sophie. There are crackers in the cabinet, but check the date before eating anything." Mason handed her a sketchbook. "I need to finish the lobby. Stay with Frank." Sophie looked at the break room walls. "There are no windows. Neither are there in most schools," Frank said. Sophie considered this and sat down. For 20 minutes she drew quietly while Frank completed inventory sheets. Then the radio on his belt called him to the parking garage. Frank stood. "I will be back in 5 minutes." Mason was working one floor below. Sophie promised to stay in the room. She lasted 3 minutes. When Mason returned, the chair was empty. His pulse surged. He checked the hall, the restrooms, and the supply closet. Then he hurried toward the elevators, calling her name under his breath. On the design floor, Grace was leaving a meeting when she noticed a child sitting beside the windows. Sophie had spread her sketchbook across her knees. Beyond the glass, rain blurred the city into a watercolor. Grace approached slowly. "Are you lost?" Sophie did not look up. "No, my dad is." Grace lowered herself onto the bench. "That sounds serious. He is always trying to find things." "What kind of things? People who are not weird." Grace smiled. "Any luck?" Sophie considered the question. "One person brings him coffee." Grace's smile faded into surprise. Before she could respond, Mason appeared around the corner. "Sophie." The relief in his voice made both of them look up. Sophie closed her sketchbook. "I stayed in the building. You were supposed to stay in the room. There were no windows." Mason stopped in front of Grace. "I am sorry. Her school closed. You do not need to apologize for having a daughter." Sophie looked between them. "You are the coffee lady?" Grace laughed. "I suppose I am." Mason rubbed a hand over his face. "This is Sophie." Grace held out her hand. "Grace." Sophie shook it. "My dad says you are kind." Mason froze. Grace glanced at him. "Does he? He also said that instead of pretty?" "Sophie, what you did." Grace rescued him by turning toward the sketchbook. "What are you drawing?" Sophie opened it reluctantly. A house filled the page. It had tall windows, a crooked roof, and 3 figures standing in front. One was a child. One was a man. The third figure had no face. Grace pointed to the building. "This is beautiful. The roof is wrong. Roofs are allowed to be wrong in drawings. My dad says buildings should not fall down. He sounds exhausting." "He is." Mason folded his arms. "I am standing here." Sophie turned another page. "This is a house where my dad stops being sad." The humor disappeared from the hallway. Mason felt something tighten in his throat. Grace did not look at him. She sat beside Sophie and studied the drawing as if the child had handed her a real set of plans. "It needs a bigger kitchen," Grace said. "Why, so there is room for a long table. We already have a big table. Does everyone eat together?" Sophie shook her head. "Dad works." Grace picked up a pencil and extended the kitchen wall. "What about this?" Sophie watched closely. "Why is the table so long so nobody has to eat alone?" Mason stood several feet away, unable to move. Grace had no idea who he was. She did not know about the house overlooking the water, the staff, the inheritance, or the family photographs that appeared in business magazines. She saw only a tired man in a janitor's uniform and a child who wanted him home for dinner. And she made room for both of them. When the rain eased, Grace suggested they get something to eat before Mason took Sophie home. "There is a food truck near Pike Place that makes the best grilled cheese in the city." Sophie looked at Mason. "Can we?" He checked the time. It was almost 6. He had planned to cook at home, but Sophie was already gathering her pencils. "All right." The three of them walked beneath shared umbrellas through streets shining with rain. Cars hissed across wet pavement. The air smelled of coffee, salt water, and bread from the market. They found the truck parked beneath a striped awning. Sophie ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup. Grace chose tacos. Mason bought the cheapest item on the menu, still committed to living within his temporary wages. Grace noticed. "You do not have to order like the menu offended you. I am not very hungry. You have been working since 5. I ate a sandwich." When Mason hesitated, Grace turned to the vendor. "Add another order of tacos. I can pay for my own dinner." "I know." "Then why are you doing that?" "Because Sophie should not have to watch her father pretend half a sandwich is dinner." Sophie nodded. "She does that." Mason looked at both of them. "I am beginning to regret introducing you." They sat at a narrow table beneath the awning. Rain tapped against the plastic roof while people hurried past with umbrellas. Sophie dipped her sandwich into soup and studied Grace. "Are you rich?" Mason nearly dropped his cup. Grace blinked. "No. Do you want to be Sophie?" Grace raised one hand. "It is all right." She thought for a moment. "I want enough money to choose where I live, help people I love, and leave a job if it makes me miserable." Sophie waited. Grace continued. "I do not want enough money to forget that other people still have problems." Mason lowered his eyes. Sophie seemed satisfied. "My dad says money makes people weird. I said it can make relationships complicated. You also said women look at your wallet." Grace turned toward him. Mason stared at his daughter. "Sophie, eat your soup." Grace hid a smile behind her cup. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep against Mason's shoulder while they waited for a car. Grace stood beside him beneath the awning. "She is wonderful. She is honest. That can be wonderful. Not always." Grace looked at Sophie. "How long have you been raising her alone? 3 years. Her mother lives in Boston." Grace heard the answer he did not give. "I am sorry." Mason adjusted Sophie's weight. "She calls sometimes." Grace nodded and did not ask more. The restraint made him want to tell her everything. Instead, he asked, "What about you? What about me? You know more about my life than I know about yours. That is because your daughter conducts interviews. She is thorough." Grace looked out at the street. "I was engaged once." Mason waited. He worked in real estate. His name was Preston. Something in her voice sharpened around the memory. "We met when I was 28. He liked my work. At least that is what I thought." "What happened?" "He began using my designs in presentations without telling anyone they were mine. When I objected, he said we were building a future together, so credit should not matter." Mason felt anger rise before he could hide it. "What did you say? I said a future built on disappearing me did not sound like much of a future." Grace watched rainwater gather along the edge of the awning. "He liked having me beside him. He did not like me standing on my own." "Was he wealthy, very? Is that why you distrust rich men?" Grace turned toward him. "I do not distrust rich men." Mason met her eyes. "I distrust people who believe money excuses dishonesty." The city noise seemed to fall away. Mason opened his mouth. He could tell her. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to stop the lie from growing. Sophie stirred against his shoulder. "Dad, I am here." Her eyes remained closed. The car pulled to the curb. The moment passed. At work, Grace's conflict with Derek became harder to ignore. He removed 2 members from her design team and reassigned them to a luxury hotel project. He scheduled client meetings without including her. He instructed accounting to revise the waterfront numbers without her approval. Grace responded by working later. Mason often found her alone after 9, surrounded by sketches, budget sheets, and empty coffee cups. One night she sat on the floor beside a broken printer while paper spilled across the carpet. "Do not say anything," she warned when Mason entered. "I was going to ask if this was a new design installation. It hates me." "The printer, everything with a power button." Mason crouched beside the machine. He removed the paper tray, found a torn sheet wrapped around a roller, and pulled it free. The printer hummed back to life. Grace stared at him. "You repair office equipment, too." "I contain multitudes." She leaned back against the cabinet. "You know, every time I think I understand you, you do something that makes less sense. That sounds like understanding." Grace watched him replace the tray. "Derek wants the affordable units removed before Friday. What happens if you refuse?" "He gives the project to Natalie and says I could not meet the budget." Mason looked at the figures on the floor. "May I?" Grace hesitated, then handed him the spreadsheet. He scanned the columns. The financing structure was familiar. Reed Global had used a similar model years earlier before Derek joined the company. "You could separate the public space improvements into a city partnership," Mason said, "then move part of the energy system into a long-term operating contract. The construction cost drops without removing housing." Grace stared at him. "Where did you learn that Mason realized he had gone too far?" "I read about something similar." "Where?" "I do not remember." "You do not remember reading a financing structure that half our accounting team missed." He placed the paper on the desk. "It was only an idea." Grace stood. "No, do not do that. Do what give me something brilliant, then act as though it fell out of the ceiling." Mason looked toward the hallway. Grace stepped in front of him. "You keep appearing with answers no janitor should have. Maybe you underestimate janitors." Her expression hardened. "I do not. I think you underestimate me. That is not what I meant." "Then tell me what you mean." Mason searched for an answer that would not become another lie. "I had access to more education than my job suggests. What happened? I made mistakes. What kind? The kind that make a man want a quieter life." Grace studied his face. "Is Mason even your real name?" "Yes." It was the cleanest truth he could offer. She looked down at the spreadsheet. "I am not asking because I care about your job title. I know. I am asking because I care about who I am trusting." His chest tightened. "I am not trying to hurt you." Grace's voice softened, but only slightly. "That is not the same as being honest." She gathered the papers from the floor. Mason left without another word. The next morning, Grace did not bring coffee. By noon, Frank's knee had swollen so badly that he could barely stand. Mason found him gripping the edge of a supply shelf. "You are going home." Frank shook his head. "We are short 2 people. You can hardly walk." "I have hardly walked for 6 years." Frank tried to take a step and collapsed. Mason caught him before his head struck the floor. The shift supervisor arrived and looked toward the hallway. "Get him into the break room. He needs an ambulance," Mason said. "We do not know that. He cannot stand. If we call emergency services from company property, there will be an incident report." Mason stared at him. "You are worried about paperwork. I am worried about procedure." A voice came from behind them. "Then follow it." Grace stood in the doorway. She pulled out her phone and called emergency services. The supervisor stepped toward her. "Ms. Bennett, this is a facilities matter. This is a human being. You are interfering." Grace held his gaze. "If you retaliate against him for needing medical care, I will document every word you just said." The supervisor backed away. At the hospital, Frank was taken for scans. Mason sat in the waiting room with his elbows on his knees. Grace returned from the vending machine and handed him a bottle of water. "You did not have to stay," he said. "Neither did you. He is my friend." Grace sat beside him. Exactly. For a while, they listened to the soft announcements over the hospital speakers. Mason looked at her. "I am sorry." "For what?" "For making you feel foolish for asking questions." Grace turned the bottle between her hands. "I do not need every detail of your past, I know. But I need to know that when you say something, it is real." Mason looked toward the closed treatment doors. My daughter is real. Frank is real. The way I feel when I am with you is real. Grace's breath caught, but she did not look away. That is a dangerous answer. It is the only one I have. Later, they walked home beneath a thin rain. At the entrance to Mason's apartment building, Grace stopped under the awning. Sophie deserves someone who keeps promises. So do you. The space between them narrowed. Grace lifted her face. Mason could feel the warmth of her breath. For one suspended moment, he allowed himself to imagine telling her everything and surviving the consequences. Then, Rebecca's betrayal flashed through his mind. Claire's voice at the restaurant. Sophie asking whether Grace would leave. He stepped back. Grace's expression closed. What are you afraid of? Mason looked at the Reed Tower reflected in a puddle across the street. That you will see me differently. I already see you differently. That is the problem. Grace held his gaze for another second, then turned toward the rain. Across the street, inside a parked sedan, a camera shutter clicked. A man lowered the lens and examined the photograph of Mason, Grace, and Sophie beneath the awning. He placed a call. Derek answered on the second ring. The janitor has no employment history before 3 months ago, the investigator said. Derek stood alone in his office looking down at the city. Then find out who he was before he became Mason. Derek ended the call and stood alone in his office, watching rain slide down the glass. Far below, the night crew moved through the lobby with carts and buckets. From the 46th floor, they looked like pieces on a board. Small, replaceable, easy to move. But Mason no longer looked small to him. A temporary janitor with no employment history had corrected an engineering calculation, understood corporate financing, and earned the trust of the one person Derek had spent months trying to control. That was not coincidence. It was infiltration. The private investigator called again the following afternoon. I found a listed address, he said. Apartment on Western Avenue. The property belongs to a Reed Global subsidiary. Derek leaned back in his chair. Who authorized the lease? The record is sealed. Employment file restricted. Social Security history. That is where it gets strange. There is enough information to pass routine review, but almost nothing before this year. Derek looked toward the framed photograph of himself shaking Eleanor Reed's hand at an industry dinner. Someone built him. That is one possibility. What is the other? That someone important does not want him found? Derek turned his chair toward the window. Eleanor had become harder to read over the past year. She attended fewer meetings but asked sharper questions. She had recently ordered a review of executive spending and delayed the announcement of the next chief executive. Derek had spent 15 years preparing for that position. He had sacrificed friendship, sleep, and a marriage that had finally collapsed under the weight of his ambition. He had told himself every loss would be justified when Eleanor handed him the company. Now a janitor appeared with a sealed file and impossible knowledge. Derek did not believe in accidents. Keep following him, he said, especially the woman and the child. The investigator hesitated. The child. Everyone has a weakness. Derek ended the call before the man could object. Across the building, Grace stood inside a conference room defending the waterfront project for the 3rd time that week. Derek had removed 2 members from her team. He had also invited Natalie Cross to the meeting without explanation. Natalie sat beside him in a cream-colored suit, tapping notes into a tablet while Grace presented revised cost estimates. The city partnership preserves the public garden and the affordable units, Grace said. The operating contract reduces the initial construction cost by 8%. Derek studied the page in front of him. This structure did not appear in your previous proposal. It does now. Who developed it? Grace met his eyes. My department. That was not my question. It is the answer that matters. Natalie stopped typing. Derek closed the folder. I am removing you from Friday's client presentation. Grace stared at him. On what grounds? Concerns about judgment? My numbers have been verified. This is not only about numbers. Then say what it is about. Derek glanced toward the glass wall. Mason was emptying a bin outside the room. Grace followed his gaze. Derek lowered his voice. You have become distracted. By what? By whom? Grace's shoulders became still. My personal life is none of your business. In this company, perception is everyone's business. There is no company policy preventing me from speaking to a member of the custodial staff. No, there is only common sense. Natalie looked down at her tablet, but Grace saw the faint curve of her mouth. Grace gathered her papers. You are removing me because I refused to cut affordable housing from a project my team designed. I am removing you because clients need confidence in the person leading the room, and you think knowing a janitor makes me less credible. I think allowing one into confidential areas makes you reckless. Grace stopped. What are you accusing me of nothing yet? The final word was deliberate. Grace looked from Derek to Natalie. Then she placed both palms on the table. If you have evidence that I violated a policy, present it. If you do not keep Mason out of this. Derek smiled. You are proving my point. Grace walked out before anger made her careless. Mason was waiting beside his cart. He had heard enough to understand. I am sorry, he said. Grace kept walking. For what? For giving him another weapon. She stopped near the elevators. You did not remove me from the presentation. No. You did not spend months stealing credit from my team. No. Then stop apologizing for his choices. Mason looked through the glass wall. Derek was speaking quietly to Natalie. He is interested in me. He is threatened by anyone he cannot control. This feels different. Grace turned toward him. What are you not telling me? The elevator opened. Several employees stepped out, forcing them apart. Mason lowered his voice. Not here. Grace searched his face. Then where? He had no answer that would not expose everything. She stepped into the elevator. Exactly. The doors closed between them. That evening, Mason waited in the underground garage beside a concrete pillar marked with the Reed family parking designation. Eleanor arrived through a private stairwell. She had dismissed her driver and carried no umbrella. Rain darkened the shoulders of her coat. You said it was urgent. Derek is investigating me. Eleanor's expression sharpened. How much does he know enough to see the file is false? Then we end it. Mason looked toward the security camera above the exit. I want to tell Grace myself. That was always your responsibility. I should have told her earlier. Yes. The directness of the answer made him look at her. Eleanor stepped closer. You did not come here for comfort. No. You came because you want permission. I came because this affects more than me. It always did. Mason lowered his eyes. Grace's words returned to him. That is not the same as being honest. I thought I was protecting Sophie. You were protecting the part of yourself that still believes every woman will become Rebecca. Grace is not Rebecca. I know. Mason looked at his mother. That is why I am afraid. Eleanor's face softened. He had rarely seen her look tired, but she looked tired now. Tell her tonight. What about the experiment? It stopped being an experiment when you fell in love. Mason said nothing. Eleanor continued. You may lose her. I know. Do not soften the truth to control how she receives it. I know, and do not blame me when she asks why you lied. Mason's jaw tightened. It was your idea, and you accepted it. He held her gaze. For several seconds the garage was silent except for the rain striking the ramp outside. Then Mason nodded. You are right. Eleanor touched his arm. Go. Mason returned to the design floor just after 8. Most of the offices were dark. Grace sat alone at her desk, revising the presentation Derek had taken from her. A lamp cast warm light over the drawings. Mason stopped outside the open door. Grace. She did not look up. I thought your shift ended. It did. Then you should go home. I need to tell you something. Her hand became still over the page. Mason stepped inside. He had rehearsed the first sentence in the elevator, but now every version sounded like another attempt to manage the truth. Grace looked up. For one moment neither of them spoke. Then the fire alarm sounded. The sudden noise tore through the floor. Red lights flashed along the ceiling. Grace stood. What is happening? Mason looked toward the hall. Employees began leaving their offices. A security announcement instructed everyone to use the stairs. Mason and Grace joined the evacuation. By the time they reached the lobby, smoke had been traced to an overheated electrical unit near the loading dock. There was no fire, but the building remained closed while maintenance inspected the system. Grace stood beneath the awning outside, surrounded by employees and emergency vehicles. Mason tried to reach her, but Derek appeared at her side. The client presentation has been moved to tomorrow morning, he said. You removed me. I need your revised figures. Ask Natalie. She does not understand the model. Grace laughed without humor. That sounds like a judgment problem. Derek's eyes moved toward Mason. You should go home, Grace. She followed his gaze, then looked back at Mason. The moment had gone. Mason watched her leave in a taxi while rainwater ran from his hair into the collar of his uniform. He told himself he would speak to her the next morning. At 6:15, Grace arrived at the design floor and found the doors sealed by security. 2 officers stood outside her department. Derek and Natalie were already inside with the head of Human Resources. Grace approached. What happened? The Human Resources Director stepped into the hall. Several confidential files are missing. What files? The final waterfront contract client pricing records and material bids. Grace reached for her access card. I need to see my office. Not yet. These are my project documents. That is why we need you to wait. Across the floor, the service elevator opened. Mason pushed his cleaning cart into the hallway. One of the security officers stopped him. Mason, leave the cart where it is. Mason looked at Grace. Her face had gone pale. The officer searched the top shelf, then opened the supply compartment beneath the bucket. He removed a black flash drive sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. Mason stared at it. I have never seen that. The officer opened a laptop on a nearby desk and inserted the drive. Folders appeared on the screen. Waterfront contract, private bids, client records. Grace stepped forward. That proves nothing. Anyone could have put it there. Derek emerged from the department. His access card was used near the archive after midnight. Mason looked at him. I was not here after midnight. The records say otherwise. Then the records are wrong. Derek folded his arms. You have shown an unusual interest in confidential company work. Grace turned toward him. He found an error in a discarded drawing. That does not make him a thief. He also provided financial advice about a restricted proposal. Mason felt the room shift. Employees had gathered along the hall. Some whispered. Others stared at him with the satisfaction of people whose suspicions had finally been rewarded. Natalie stood beside the conference room door. I knew something was wrong with him. Grace faced her. No, you decided something was wrong because of his uniform. Natalie's expression hardened. The Human Resources Director approached Mason. You are suspended while we investigate. Mason looked at the flash drive. He could end the humiliation immediately. He could speak his last name and watch every face in the room change. But doing so would not prove who planted the files. It would only prove that power could protect him. He removed his identification badge. I understand. Grace stepped between him and the officers. You cannot escort him out as if he is guilty. This is standard procedure, the director said. Then apply it to everyone with access. We are reviewing all records. Derek spoke from behind them. Grace stepped aside. She turned. You do not give me orders outside my department. I removed you from that department yesterday. The word struck harder than he intended. Grace stared at him. Mason gently touched her arm. Do not lose your job for me. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Did you do this? No. The answer came without hesitation. Grace stepped aside, but her eyes did not leave him. Security walked beside Mason toward the elevators. The lobby was crowded when they arrived. Frank stood near the reception desk with Sophie. Mrs. Lewis had called that morning to say she was ill, and Frank had agreed to watch Sophie until Eleanor's staff could collect her. Sophie saw the officers first. Then she saw Mason without his badge. Dad. Her voice carried through the lobby. Every head turned. Mason stopped. Sophie ran toward him. One officer instinctively moved forward, but Mason raised a hand. She is my daughter. Sophie looked from the officers to his face. What happened? Someone took company files. Why are they walking with you? They think I may know something you do not. No. Her eyes filled with fear. Mason knelt. I am all right. You are lying. The accusation was quiet and immediate. Grace reached the lobby seconds later. She saw Sophie and hurried toward them. Mason rose as security instructed him to continue. Grace crouched in front of Sophie. Your dad is going to be all right. Sophie looked at her. You do not know that. Grace glanced toward Mason. No, but I know he did not do this. Mason heard her as the elevator doors closed. At the emergency meeting that afternoon, Derek placed printed access logs on the conference table. The evidence shows Mason's card entered the design archive at 12:17 in the morning. Grace examined the record. What time was his cleaning cart moved from the loading dock? Derek frowned. What does that have to do with anything the rear wheel was being repaired yesterday? Natalie looked up too quickly. Grace noticed. The Human Resources Director checked another report. The cart was signed out at 11:42. By whom? There is a custodial signature. Derek tapped the access log. The flash drive was found in his equipment. His card opened the archive. We do not need to invent a conspiracy. Grace looked at the file information displayed on the screen. When were these documents copied? 12:26. What program created the archive? The Information Technology Manager checked. SecurePack. Grace leaned back. Mason does not know how to use SecurePack. Derek laughed. And how exactly would you know what software the janitor uses, because I pay attention to people who work around me? Several board members exchanged glances. Derek's expression cooled. Your personal attachment has compromised your judgment. Then investigate me too. Silence followed. Grace pushed the access logs toward the center of the table. Search my computer, review my messages, check every camera, but do not call this an investigation if you have already decided the lowest paid person is the easiest one to blame. After the meeting, Grace found Frank in the custodial break room. His knee was wrapped in a brace from the hospital visit. He sat at the plastic table with the cart repair sheet in front of him. You should be home, Grace said. So should you. She sat across from him. Who took Mason's cart? Frank pointed to the signature. That is supposed to be mine. It looks similar. It is not. How can you tell? Frank tapped the bottom of the page. Whoever wrote it spelled Delgado with 2 L's. Grace looked closer. Who makes that mistake? Frank gave her a tired smile. Mr. Vaughn has called me Frank Delgado for 7 years. They requested the loading dock footage. The first camera showed the cart near the repair station at 11:30. At 11:40, Natalie entered the dock wearing a dark coat. She looked around, took the cart, and pushed it toward the service elevator. Grace watched the recording twice. Frank folded his arms. She knew exactly where she was going. Grace found Natalie in her office. She closed the door behind her and placed a still image from the footage on the desk. Natalie looked at it, then at Grace. You accessed restricted security records. I requested evidence related to an employee accusation. You have no authority. Neither did you have authority to move that cart. Natalie's face remained controlled, but her fingers tightened around a pen. Derek asked me to bring it upstairs. Why? He said facilities had approved it. Did he give you the flash drive? No. Did you use Mason's card? No. Did you know he planned to frame him? Natalie stood. Careful. Were you helping Derek? I moved a cart. You moved evidence. I did not know what he intended. Grace studied her. For the first time, Natalie looked frightened rather than offended. Then tell the investigators exactly what happened. Natalie looked toward the closed office door. Derek has protected my position for years. He will not protect you when protecting himself becomes easier. That evening, Natalie gave a formal statement. Security recovered footage of Derek entering the design floor minutes after Natalie delivered the cart. The angle did not show him placing the flash drive inside, but it proved his earlier statement that he had been home was false. The board ordered a full investigation. Mason's suspension remained in place while digital records were examined. Derek was not removed immediately. His attorney argued that the footage showed only that he entered his own workplace. The company's 40th anniversary gala was 4 days away. Eleanor insisted that every step follow proper procedure. Mason understood why. Grace did not. At the apartment, Sophie sat on the floor while Mason packed clothes into a suitcase. She watched him remove shirts from the closet. Why are we leaving? This apartment belongs to the company. You own the company. Mason closed his eyes. I do not own it yet. You could tell them who you are. Yes, then tell them. It would change how they investigate what happened. It would make them stop treating you like a criminal. That is not the same as proving I am innocent. Sophie stood. You told me lies hurt people, I know. You are hurting Grace. Mason looked at her. She thinks you are Mason from cleaning. I am Mason. You know what I mean. She wiped at her eyes angrily. You let her tell you things. You let me like her. You let her think we needed help. Mason sat on the edge of the bed. I never wanted to hurt her. Sophie's voice shook. But you did. He looked down at the pink bracelet on his wrist. His daughter understood the truth with a clarity he had spent months avoiding. Good intentions did not make deception harmless. I was afraid, he said, of Grace of losing her. Sophie looked toward the half-empty closet. You can lose people by lying, too. Mason had no defense left. The following morning, Grace went to the apartment. She knocked for several minutes before using the number Mason had once given her. The phone rang inside. No one answered. A building manager eventually opened the door after Grace explained that she was checking on a child. The apartment was empty. The small table was gone. Sophie's drawings had been removed from the refrigerator. The bedroom closet stood open. Grace walked slowly through the silent rooms. On the kitchen counter lay the pink friendship bracelet Sophie had made for Mason. Grace picked it up. The thread was frayed where it had caught on the edge of his cleaning cart. She held it in her palm and felt a sadness deeper than anger. Mason had disappeared without a word. So had Sophie. That afternoon, Derek received a sealed envelope from the private investigator. Inside was a photograph taken several years earlier at a memorial service on Bainbridge Island. Eleanor Reed stood beside a younger man in a black suit. The man's face was turned toward her. Derek placed the photograph beside an old newspaper clipping about Eleanor's rarely seen son. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same man. He stared at the janitor in the memorial photograph until disbelief gave way to understanding. "You are not a spy," Derek whispered. His fingers tightened around the edge of the image. "You are the heir." Derek remained alone in his office long after the investigator left. The photograph lay beneath the yellow light of his desk lamp. Eleanor Reed stood beside Mason at a private memorial service, her hand resting against his arm with an intimacy no executive would ever receive. Derek opened an old article on his computer. The photograph in the article showed Eleanor with her only son, Mason Reed, during a university ceremony nearly 15 years earlier. Mason looked younger, cleaner, untouched by divorce or exhaustion, but the face was unmistakable. The janitor had been standing inside Reed Global for 3 months, listening, watching, learning who treated him badly. Derek pushed away from the desk. A cold pressure gathered in his chest as he remembered every insult, every dismissive command, every moment Mason had watched him undermine Grace. This had never been an accident. Eleanor had planted her son inside the company. And if Mason became chief executive officer, Derek's career would not merely stall, it would end. He lifted the photograph again. Then another thought came to him. Grace did not know. Derek had watched her defend Mason, risk her career, and challenge senior leadership for a man she believed was a temporary custodian. He had also watched Mason allow her to do it without revealing the truth. The knowledge gave Derek something he had not possessed since the investigation began: leverage. The 40th anniversary gala began 4 evenings later. By sunset, the lobby of Reed Global no longer resembled a place where employees hurried through security carrying coffee and unfinished reports. Tall arrangements of white roses stood beneath the glass walls. Golden light washed over the marble floor. Archival photographs from the company's history appeared across enormous screens, beginning with Eleanor's first drafting table in a rented office and ending with towers, research centers, and residential developments across the country. A string quartet played near the staircase. Servers moved through the room with silver trays. Outside, rain softened the Seattle skyline until every building appeared to float in gray mist. The custodial team had worked since early morning preparing the space. Frank stood near a service corridor wearing a clean black uniform instead of his usual navy shirt. A brace remained beneath his trouser leg, though he tried to hide the stiffness in his walk. He watched executives cross the floor beneath chandeliers that had been polished by workers whose names many of them did not know. Natalie approached him, holding a glass of champagne. "The floor looks excellent," she said. Frank looked down at the marble. "It looked excellent yesterday, too." Natalie paused. He lifted his eyes to her. "You just did not notice." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Frank returned to arranging glasses on a service table. Grace arrived alone. She wore a dark green dress with simple lines and no jewelry beyond small silver earrings. Her hair fell loosely over one shoulder. The invitation had remained on her kitchen counter for 2 days before she decided to attend. Part of her wanted answers from the investigation. Another part wanted to know whether Mason might appear. She hated herself for that hope. 4 days had passed since she found the empty apartment. There had been no message, no explanation, no call from Sophie. Grace had returned to work, but every hallway reminded her of him. She still looked toward the custodial cart near the design floor before remembering it would remain untouched. The repaired model sat on her desk. The black coffee she bought each morning tasted wrong when there was only 1 cup. She had spent months wondering what Mason was hiding. Now she wondered whether anything he had shown her had been real. As Grace entered the ballroom, several colleagues greeted her with smiles that felt too careful. News of her connection to the suspended custodian had spread through the company. Some people admired her loyalty. Others treated it like evidence of poor judgment. Natalie crossed the room and approached her. "You came." Grace looked at her. "Was I not supposed to? I thought the investigation might make tonight uncomfortable." The investigation into Derek or the investigation into the man he framed? Natalie lowered her voice. "I gave a full statement. After you were shown the footage. I did not know what Derek intended. You knew he wanted the cart moved in the middle of the night. I thought it involved a security review." Grace studied her. "You thought what was most convenient?" Natalie glanced around to see who might be listening. "I am trying to correct the situation. Then stop worrying about who is watching you do it." Grace walked away. Near the central stage, a large photograph showed Eleanor standing before the company's first completed building. Grace stared at it. Behind her, Derek's voice spoke softly. "You look as though you are waiting for someone." She turned. Derek wore a black tuxedo and a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "I am waiting for the board to announce your resignation. You may be disappointed. The footage places you inside the design department. It places me at work. You lied during the investigation. My attorney has addressed that." Grace looked past him. "Why are you still here?" "Because unlike your janitor, I did not disappear." The word tightened something inside her. Derek saw it. "You defended a man you knew nothing about. I knew enough. No, you knew what he wanted you to see." Grace held his gaze. "What do you want, Derek? I thought you deserved the truth before Eleanor turns this evening into a spectacle." What truth? Derek reached inside his jacket. Before he could remove the photograph, the lights dimmed. The quartet stopped playing. Conversations faded across the lobby as Eleanor Reed stepped onto the stage. She wore a deep blue gown and carried no notes. At 64, she still possessed the ability to quiet a room simply by standing inside it. 40 years ago, she began Reed Global existed in a rented room above a grocery store. Images of that first office appeared on the screens. 1 desk, 2 chairs, a drafting board. More debt than sense. Soft laughter moved through the crowd. Eleanor continued. "We grew because people believed buildings could do more than occupy space. They could create opportunity. They could protect families. They could shape the dignity of ordinary life." Grace listened, but her attention remained partly fixed on Derek. He had returned the photograph to his jacket. Eleanor spoke about the company's history, its mistakes, and the responsibilities that came with its size. Then her tone changed. "A company's future is not determined only by what it builds. It is determined by what it is willing to see." A hush settled across the room. For the past several months, someone has been seeing Reed Global from a place few leaders ever stand. Grace felt the first movement of unease. Eleanor looked toward the staircase. "It is time for me to introduce the person selected by the board to lead this company into its next chapter." A spotlight moved across the upper landing. A man stepped into the light. Grace stopped breathing. Mason stood at the top of the staircase in a tailored black suit. His posture had changed. The quiet curve he carried in the custodial hallways was gone. He stood straight, composed, and unmistakably accustomed to rooms filled with powerful people. Yet the face was the same eyes that had watched her draw beside Sophie, the same mouth that had almost kissed her beneath the rain, the same hands that had repaired her model and held Frank upright on the hospital floor. Beside him stood Sophie in a blue dress holding his hand. A sound moved through the ballroom. Not a single gasp, but hundreds of small breaths caught at once. Natalie went pale. Someone near the bar whispered Mason's name. Frank stared up at the staircase. Then he began to laugh softly. Mason and Sophie descended together. As they reached the final step, Sophie looked across the room and found Grace. Her expression brightened for a fraction of a second. Then she saw Grace's face. Her smile disappeared. Eleanor extended her hand toward Mason. "My son, Mason Reed." The room erupted in whispers. Grace felt people turning toward her. They knew, or they thought they knew. They saw the woman who had been sharing meals with a janitor and now discovered she had been courting the billionaire heir. Several faces carried surprise. Some carried envy. A few carried amusement. Grace heard none of it clearly. Her mind returned to every unanswered question. "Where did you learn that my mother worked in construction? Is Mason your real name? Yes, I am not trying to hurt you." The truths had been shaped carefully enough to hide the lie. Eleanor continued. "Mason will assume the role of chief executive officer following the completion of the board transition." Applause began near the front. It spread uncertainly through the ballroom. Mason stepped to the microphone. A prepared speech rested on the podium. He looked down at it. Then he looked at Grace. She stood near the edge of the crowd, perfectly still. The bracelet Sophie had made lay inside Grace's purse. She had brought it without knowing why. Mason folded the speech in half and placed it aside. "For the past 3 months, many of you knew me as Mason from custodial services." The applause stopped. "I entered this building through the loading dock. I cleaned conference rooms, restrooms, elevators, and offices. I ate in the custodial break room. I worked beside people whose names many senior leaders have never learned." His gaze moved toward Frank. Frank's laughter had ended. He watched Mason with an expression Grace could not read. Mason continued. "Some employees treated me with kindness. Some treated me with contempt. Most passed without looking at me at all." Derek stood near the center of the room, his face controlled. Mason's voice remained calm. "I saw managers speak about respect in meetings, then refuse to greet the people who cleaned the room afterward. I saw temporary workers choose between lunch and transportation. I watched an injured man delay medical care because paperwork mattered more to his supervisor than pain. The facility supervisor lowered his eyes. I also saw courage. I saw employees defend people who could offer them nothing. I saw someone risk her career for a man she believed had no power." Every face turned toward Grace. The attention felt like heat. Mason looked directly at her. "I will never forget that." Grace's eyes filled, but not with joy. She saw the ballroom as he must have seen it from behind a cleaning cart. Every smile, every judgment, every hidden intention. She had not been loved inside an ordinary life. She had been observed inside an experiment. Derek moved closer to her. "You understand now," he whispered. Grace turned away from him. Sophie watched from beside Eleanor as Grace reached into her purse. She removed the pink bracelet. For a moment she held it in her hand. Then she closed her fingers around it and walked toward the exit. Sophie took one step forward. "Grace." Her voice was lost beneath the renewed whispers. Mason saw Grace leave. He stepped away from the microphone. Eleanor touched his arm. "Finish." "I cannot." "Mason." He looked at Sophie. She pointed toward the doors. "You have to go." Mason left the stage. People moved aside as he crossed the ballroom. Employees who had once refused to meet his eyes now watched him with fascination. He did not see any of them. Outside the main doors, the hallway was empty. He followed the direction of the terrace signs and found Grace on a covered balcony overlooking Elliott Bay. Rain struck the glass walls around her. The city lights blurred beyond them. Grace stood with both hands against the railing. Mason stopped several feet away. "Grace." She did not turn. "I was going to tell you." Her shoulders lifted with one quiet breath. When he had rehearsed explanations for months, none survived the question. "Before tonight." She faced him. "That is not a time. I tried at the office. The fire alarm interrupted you, so you disappeared for 4 days. The board moved the announcement forward. My mother's legal team wanted me out of the apartment before the investigation became public. You have a phone." "I know." "You know." Her voice trembled. "That seems to be your answer for everything." Mason stepped closer. "I was afraid anything I said would expose the truth before I could explain it properly." Grace gave a small, disbelieving laugh. You needed the perfect room, the perfect words, the perfect moment. No. Yes, because then you could control how I reacted. That was not what I wanted. What did you want? Mason looked at her. I wanted you to know me before you knew what I owned. Grace's eyes hardened. So you decided I did not deserve the same choice. He stopped. She continued. You knew my history. You knew Preston used my work and hid the truth whenever it benefited him. I told you money did not excuse dishonesty. I remember every word, and you said nothing. I almost told you. You almost trusted me. The rain became louder against the glass. Mason looked down at the pink bracelet around his wrist. I had been married to someone who used private information from my family to build a life with another man. Grace's expression changed slightly, but she remained silent. The divorce became public. Reporters waited outside Sophie's school. Children repeated things they heard at home. She learned her mother had betrayed us before she was old enough to understand what betrayal meant. His voice lost its practiced steadiness. After that, every relationship felt like a negotiation. Women asked about company shares before they asked what Sophie liked to eat. One woman called my daughter an obstacle. Another pretended to enjoy spending time with her, then asked me to send Sophie away for the summer. Grace looked toward the ballroom doors. Through the glass, Sophie stood beside Eleanor, watching them from a distance. Mason followed her gaze. I did not only need someone who could love me without the Reed name. I needed someone who could care for Sophie without seeing her as an entrance into this family. Grace turned back. And you thought the answer was to test us. I thought the answer was to remove the money. You cannot remove money when it still controls the entire situation. Mason frowned. I lived on the same wages. I did the work. You could stop whenever you wanted. The words landed with unmistakable force. Frank could not. The other custodians could not. I could not walk away from Derek without losing my career. You wore power like a costume you could take off at the end of the day. Mason looked through the rain-covered glass. He had believed discomfort made the experiment honest. Grace showed him the difference between discomfort and vulnerability. She stepped closer. You let me tell you things I had never told anyone in this company. I never pretended to care. That is not enough. I know my feelings were real. So were mine. Her voice broke. That is why this hurts. Mason reached toward her, then stopped before touching her. Grace looked at his hand. You tested whether I was good enough to love you. That is not how I saw it. How did you see it as the only way to know? She shook her head. Did you ever ask whether you were honest enough to love me? Mason had no answer. The silence between them became the first truth he had not tried to shape. Grace wiped beneath one eye. You let me care about Sophie. She cares about you. That makes it worse. Grace, you let a child participate in your lie. I never asked her to deceive you directly. You asked her to keep your identity secret. I thought I was protecting her. No. Grace looked toward Sophie again. You were protecting yourself. Mason felt the instinct to explain, to speak about Rebecca, to speak about fear, to describe every reason until the choice sounded inevitable. He let the instinct pass. You are right. Grace looked at him. There was no relief in her face, only exhaustion. Mason continued. I was afraid. I used Sophie's safety to justify something that protected me from rejection. I told myself that if you loved Mason the janitor, I would know your feelings were real. And now I know your feelings were real, and I gave you a reason to question mine. Grace closed her eyes. Mason's voice softened. I am sorry. She opened her hand. The pink bracelet rested in her palm. One night Sophie told me she was afraid people leave. Mason looked at the bracelet. I remember. I told her promises matter, they do. Grace looked at him. Then keep this one. Do not follow me. Do not send your mother. Do not use Sophie to reach me. Do not offer me a promotion or a house or anything else you think might make this easier. I will not. I need distance. Mason swallowed. I understand. No, you accept it. Understanding may take longer. He nodded. Grace placed the bracelet on the railing between them. I believe you cared for me. Hope rose in Mason's face before he could hide it. Grace saw it. But real feelings do not erase dishonest choices. The hope disappeared. She turned toward the door. Mason spoke once more. Will I ever see you again? Grace stopped. She did not look back. We work in the same company. That is not what I meant. I know. She walked inside. Sophie stood near the ballroom doors. Grace paused beside her. For a moment neither spoke. Sophie's eyes were red. I am sorry, she whispered. Grace crouched, careful not to let her anger reach the child. This was not your responsibility. I knew. You are 9. I still knew. Grace brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's face. You love your dad. Sophie nodded. So do I. The admission escaped before Grace could stop it. Sophie began to cry. Grace pulled her into an embrace. Across the terrace, Mason watched through the glass. Grace held Sophie for several seconds, then released her and walked toward the elevators. Sophie remained beside the doors. When Eleanor approached, Sophie turned on her. Was this your idea? Eleanor did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes. You told Dad it would help him. I believed it might. You both hurt her. Eleanor looked toward the elevator where Grace had disappeared. Yes. Sophie crossed her arms. You are supposed to be smart. Eleanor's face tightened with sadness. Being smart does not prevent people from being wrong. Mason returned to the ballroom alone. The crowd quieted as he approached the stage. The folded speech still rested on the podium. Eleanor met him at the bottom step. Are you able to continue? Mason looked across the room. Derek stood beneath one of the historical photographs, watching him. Natalie remained near Frank, holding an untouched glass. Executives waited to hear about strategy growth and leadership. Mason saw instead the hallway where security had removed his badge. He saw Frank collapsing beside a supply shelf. He saw Grace standing alone while senior leaders questioned her judgment. He stepped onto the stage. The announcement of my appointment can wait. Uneasy movement spread through the room. Several board members turned toward Eleanor. Mason continued. Before I accept the role of Chief Executive Officer, I am requesting an independent investigation into management conduct labor practices, retaliation, and the circumstances surrounding my own employment inside this company. Derek's expression changed. Mason looked directly at him. That investigation will include the theft of confidential documents, the falsification of access records, and the misuse of company resources. Derek moved toward the stage. This is absurd. Security officers stepped into his path. Mason raised his hand. Let him speak. Derek stared up at him. You came into this company under a false identity. You deceived employees. You accessed areas where you did not belong. Yes. The immediate admission silenced the room. Mason placed both hands on the podium. My actions will be included in the investigation. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. Derek laughed bitterly. You expect anyone to believe this is accountability? You are Eleanor Reed's son. This company will protect you. Mason felt the truth inside the accusation. It has protected me. The room became completely still. That is part of the problem. Derek's anger faltered. Mason looked towards the employees gathered at the back of the lobby. The investigation will report to independent counsel and the non-family members of the board. Its findings will be shared with employees. Until it is complete, my permanent appointment will remain unconfirmed. A board member rose from his table. Mason, this is neither the place nor the time. Mason looked at the ballroom. This company celebrates 40 years tonight. There may never be a better time to decide what kind of company enters the 41st. He stepped away from the microphone. No applause followed. He had not expected any. The stage lights remained on as Mason walked down the steps. Sophie met him at the bottom. She took his hand. Is Grace coming back? Mason looked toward the closed elevator doors. I do not know. Sophie pressed closer to him. Are you going after her? No. Why? Because she asked me not to. Eleanor approached slowly. Around them, conversations began again, quieter and less certain than before. Mason looked at the bracelet he still wore, then toward the second bracelet Grace had left on the terrace railing. For the first time since entering the company in a janitor's uniform, there was no identity left for Mason to hide behind. The independent investigation began the following Monday. 3 attorneys from outside Washington arrived before sunrise and took over a conference room on the 39th floor. Employees were invited to submit information anonymously. Access records were collected. Executive email accounts were preserved. Security footage from the previous 6 months was removed from the control of Reed Global Management. Mason surrendered his temporary employment file, his private messages with Eleanor, and the notebook he had carried during every custodial shift. The attorneys asked whether he wanted personal counsel present. "No," he said. One of them looked over her glasses. "You understand your conduct is also under review. Yes, you used a false employment record. Yes, you entered the company under circumstances known only to selected executives. Yes. And you developed a personal relationship with an employee who did not know your identity." Mason looked toward the window. "Yes." The attorney closed the file. "You are answering very quickly. I spent several months delaying the truth. I am finished doing that." The investigation lasted 7 weeks. Derek continued reporting to work during the first 3 days, though he was stripped of access to confidential systems. He moved through the building with the rigid confidence of a man who believed composure could still control the story. On the 4th morning, security escorted him from his office. There was no crowd waiting in the hallway, no dramatic announcement, only 2 officers, a cardboard box, and the same elevator Mason had once entered without his badge. The investigators had recovered deleted messages between Derek and the private investigator. They found invoices paid through a consulting account normally used for client research. They traced alterations in the access system to an administrator who admitted Derek had ordered the changes. Natalie's testimony confirmed the rest. Derek had instructed her to move Mason's cart to the design floor after midnight. He had told her the action was part of an internal security test. She had not seen him plant the flash drive, but cameras showed him entering the hall minutes after she left. The digital files on the drive had been packaged on Derek's computer. The investigation also uncovered years of complaints that had never reached the board. Junior employees described threats disguised as performance advice. Several women said Derek had removed them from projects after they challenged him. Former team members provided documents showing he routinely claimed credit for their work. A financial review found executive expenses tied to private travel and personal favors. Grace's waterfront proposal was not the first project he had tried to take. It was simply the first time someone refused to disappear quietly. Derek requested one final meeting with Mason before leaving the building. They met in the same conference room where Grace had defended the affordable housing plan. Derek stood beside the windows. His jacket was folded over a chair and the cardboard box rested on the table. "You had everything before you walked into this company," he said. Mason remained near the door. "That does not excuse what you did. You were born into the position I spent my life earning. You framed an innocent man. You were never in danger." Mason looked at him. Grace was. Derek's expression tightened. She made her own choices. So did you. Derek walked closer. "You want to pretend those months made you one of them. They did not. Frank could lose his apartment if he missed a paycheck. You could call your mother and end the game. I know. You wore hardship until you got tired of it. I know that too." The lack of resistance unsettled Derek more than anger would have. He glanced toward the box on the table. "When Eleanor retires, you will sit in her chair. Everyone will call you brave for cleaning floors." "No." Derek laughed. "They already are." Mason stepped closer. "If they do, they will be wrong." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Derek asked the question beneath all the others. Why you Mason understood. Why had Eleanor chosen her son instead of the executive who had served the company for 15 years? Why had inheritance outweighed ambition? Why had one man begun the race at the finish line? "I cannot give you an answer that makes it fair," Mason said. Derek looked away. Mason continued, "But you were so angry at the advantages I had that you began treating everyone with less power as though they had no value." Derek's jaw tightened. "You think you understand me? No." Mason opened the door. "I only understand what you chose to do." Derek lifted the box and walked past him. He did not say goodbye. The company terminated him that afternoon and referred the evidence involving theft, falsified access records, and misuse of corporate funds to law enforcement. Natalie remained under investigation. She had moved the cart, concealed her involvement, and allowed suspicion to remain on Mason until Grace confronted her with evidence. Yet she had also cooperated before formal charges were made and provided records that helped establish Derek's larger pattern. The board removed her from the executive leadership team. Her title disappeared from the company directory. For the first time in 12 years, Natalie returned to work without an assistant. A week later, she asked to address the custodial staff. They gathered in the break room where Eleanor had first proposed the experiment. Some stood against the lockers. Others remained seated with their arms folded. Frank occupied the chair nearest the vending machine, his injured leg stretched in front of him. Natalie stood beside the plastic table. She had prepared several pages. After looking at the faces in the room, she placed them down. I treated many of you as though your work mattered, but you did not. No one responded. I moved Mason's cart because a senior executive asked me to. I did not ask enough questions because the person who gave the order had power. I also did not care what might happen to the person who used the cart. Frank watched her. Natalie continued, I am sorry. Silence remained. She looked toward Frank. He adjusted the brace beneath his trousers. You learned our names after you found out who Mason was. Natalie lowered her eyes. Yes, learn them before the next billionaire picks up a mop. A few workers glanced at one another. Natalie nodded. I will. Frank leaned back. That takes longer than a speech. I know. She returned to work in a non-management position supporting the employee conduct review. No one trusted her immediately. Some never did. She began by listening anyway. Mason's own findings were delivered to the board in a closed meeting. The report concluded that Eleanor and Mason had not broken criminal law, but their experiment had bypassed normal hiring procedures, created ethical conflicts, and involved employees who had not consented to being observed as part of a private test. The report was especially critical of Mason's relationship with Grace. His feelings may have been sincere, but sincerity had not removed the imbalance created by his hidden identity and future authority. Mason read every page. Then he asked the board to delay his permanent appointment for 6 months. Eleanor sat across from him. The company needs stability. It needs credibility. You have already accepted responsibility. Accepting responsibility is not the same as accepting power. Several board members shifted in their chairs. Mason placed the report on the table. I entered this building believing the uniform would remove my advantage. It did not. I could leave whenever I wanted. I could reveal my name. I could call any person in this room. He looked around the table. The people I worked beside had none of those options. A senior director asked, What are you proposing? An interim chief executive with no connection to my family, 6 months of independent oversight, full implementation of the labor recommendations. After that, the board can decide whether I am qualified. Eleanor studied her son. You are willing to lose the position. I was never entitled to it simply because I was born near it. The board approved the delay by 1 vote. Over the following months, Reed Global changed slowly. Not through speeches, but through contracts, budgets, and policies that required signatures. Healthcare coverage for custodial workers was expanded. Temporary workers received paid medical leave. The company began a review of contractor wages across every property it owned. Employees could report retaliation through an outside service rather than a department controlled by senior leadership. Promotion criteria were published. Executive expenses became visible to the audit committee. Managers were required to spend scheduled time with operational teams, not for photographs, but to understand the work their decisions created. The custodial staff were invited to review building schedules and safety procedures. Frank rejected the first invitation. I have spent 20 years telling them what is broken. Mason stood beside his hospital bed after Frank's knee surgery. Tell them again. Frank looked down at the new brace. They only listen because of you. Then make them hear you while they are listening. Frank considered this. You still owe me half a sandwich. I remember. You ate the larger half. That is not how I remember it. That is because rich people rewrite history. Mason laughed. It was the first time in weeks the sound felt natural. Frank returned to the company after rehabilitation, but no longer worked full shifts on the floor. He accepted a position helping redesign safety procedures for cleaning teams across Reed Global properties. He insisted the title remain simple, Custodial Operations Advisor. Grace returned to her department 3 days after the gala. She did not ask about Mason. She did not respond to the apology he sent through company counsel because he had promised not to contact her personally. She focused on the waterfront project. Derek's removal left an open leadership position and the board offered it to her. Grace declined. Eleanor requested a private meeting. They sat in Grace's office rather than the executive suite. "You earned the position," Eleanor said. "That is not the issue. What is if I accept it now? Every decision I make will be connected to Mason. You should not have to sacrifice an opportunity because of my son. I am not sacrificing it." Grace placed a proposal on the desk. "I want the design division separated into an independent subsidiary. Its projects should be reviewed by its own board. I will not report to Mason if he becomes chief executive." Eleanor read the first page. "You prepared this quickly. I have been thinking about independence longer than I have known your son." The words carried no cruelty, but Eleanor heard their boundary. "You expect the board to approve this. I expect them to recognize that the waterfront project succeeded because my team fought to preserve it." Eleanor closed the proposal. "And if they refuse, I will leave." Eleanor looked at her. Grace did not blink. "I believe they will approve it," Eleanor said. "They should approve it because it is good for the company." "Yes, not because you want me to forgive Mason." Eleanor's face changed. "I did not come here to ask that." Grace waited. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted to help my son, and you decided the rest of us could become part of the lesson." "Yes." Grace had expected an explanation. The simple admission left less to fight. Eleanor continued. "I spent 40 years believing good intentions excused aggressive methods. That belief built much of this company. Did it make the methods right when a rain tapped softly against the office window?" Eleanor looked toward the repaired model on Grace's shelf. "I am sorry." Grace said nothing. "I am not asking you to understand why we did it." "Good. I am asking you to know that I understand why it hurt you." Grace looked down at the proposal. "That is a beginning." The independent design subsidiary was approved 1 month later. Grace became its first director. The waterfront project moved forward with every affordable unit preserved. The public garden remained. So did the child care center and the long community tables she had drawn after meeting Sophie. Mason stayed away. He did not send flowers. He did not ask Eleanor for updates. He did not arrange meetings through the board. He spoke to Grace only when legal documents required both of their approval, and those conversations remained professional. At home, he began attending therapy twice a week. During the first session, he spoke for nearly an hour about Rebecca. During the second, the therapist asked how often he had used Rebecca's betrayal to predict Grace's behavior. Mason did not return for 10 days. Then he went back. He attended Sophie's school events. He learned the names of her teachers. He cooked dinner badly and let her complain. He kept his phone in another room while she practiced piano. One night, Sophie found him washing dishes. "Do you still love Grace?" "Yes." "Then why are you not doing anything?" Mason dried his hands. "Because she asked for space. You could apologize again." "I already did." "You could send something." "She asked me not to." Sophie leaned against the counter. "That sounds hard." "It is." "What if she never comes back?" Mason looked toward the dark window. "Then I will still be grateful she was here." Sophie frowned. "That sounds like something sad people say." "It probably is." She watched him return to the dishes. "Are you giving up?" "No." "Then what are you doing? Learning that loving someone is not the same as owning the outcome." Sophie considered this for several seconds. Then she handed him another plate. 6 months after the gala, the first completed section of the waterfront development opened to the public. The morning sky was clear, but rain from the previous night still shone across the pavement. Families gathered near the new garden. Children ran between young trees. Local musicians played beside the entrance. Grace stood near the stage reviewing final notes. She saw Mason arrive with Sophie and Frank. Mason wore a simple charcoal suit. The pink bracelet remained around his wrist. He did not approach her. He greeted members of the construction team, then stood near the back while Grace spoke about the project. She thanked her designers, the engineers, the community representatives, and the employees who had refused to remove the affordable units when doing so would have been easier. Mason applauded with everyone else. After the ceremony, Grace walked toward Sophie. Sophie looked at her father. Mason remained where he was. Grace crouched and opened her hand. The old friendship bracelet rested across her palm. The frayed thread had been repaired with a small silver clasp. "I think this belongs to your dad," Grace said. Sophie examined it. Then she shook her head. I made another one. She reached into her pocket and removed a bracelet woven from 3 strands. One for me, one for Dad, one for you. Grace's eyes filled. She looked toward Mason. He made no move to interrupt. Grace turned back to Sophie. I cannot promise I will never make mistakes. Sophie nodded seriously. Dad makes a lot. Frank laughed nearby. Mason lowered his head. Grace smiled through her tears. I can promise I will not disappear without telling you. Sophie stepped forward and wrapped both arms around her. Grace held her tightly. Later, as the crowd thinned, Grace found Mason beside the water. For several moments they walked without speaking. The air smelled of wet earth and salt. Mason kept his hands inside his coat pockets. I do not expect things to return to the way they were, he said. Good. He glanced at her. Good. The way they were included a false employment record, a borrowed apartment, and several months of carefully constructed answers. That sounds bad when you list it. It was bad. Mason nodded. I know. Grace looked ahead. The man who sat beside Frank at the hospital was real. Mason said nothing. The father who listened to Sophie was real. The man who stood in front of the company and admitted he was wrong was real. I am trying to become him more often. Grace stopped walking. Mason turned toward her. She studied his face. Is that enough, he asked. No. The answer hurt, but he accepted it. Grace stepped closer. It may be enough to begin again. Mason's breath caught. He did not reach for her. Grace noticed. This time she took his hand. 1 year later they married in a small garden overlooking Puget Sound. There were no reporters, no corporate sponsors, no business partners seated according to influence. Frank walked beside Sophie along the garden path before taking his place in the front row. Eleanor stood near the flowers holding a small velvet box. After the ceremony, she offered Grace a family ring. Grace opened the box and admired it. It is beautiful. It belonged to Mason's grandmother. Grace closed the lid carefully. I will save it for special occasions. Eleanor smiled. That seems wise. The following Monday, Mason, Grace, and Sophie entered the Reed Global lobby together. Mason wore a suit. The pink bracelet remained around his wrist beside the new one Sophie had made. Near the service corridor, a young custodian struggled with a cart that pulled toward the wall. Mason stopped. He took the handle and pushed it forward. This wheel pulls left. The employee looked surprised. You have used one of these? Mason glanced at Grace. A long time ago. Frank's voice carried across the lobby. He was terrible at it. Several employees laughed. Mason returned the cart. The elevator doors opened. Sophie took his hand as they stepped inside. Dad. Yes. Did you ever find out what she looked toward Grace? What happens when somebody likes janitor you and discovers real you? Mason looked at the woman standing beside him. Grace pressed the button for the design floor. She makes him earn a second chance. The doors closed as Mason smiled.